World War II was a time of unimaginable brutality, where the darkest sides of humanity were unleashed. Amidst the chaos, the Japanese military inflicted some of the most horrific punishments on their captives. Acts so savage, they remain etched in history's darkest pages. In this list, we explore the most chilling and brutal punishments carried out by the Japanese during World War II. Number 15. Vivisection without anesthesia. In the darkest corners of World War II, hidden away from the battlefronts, a nightmare was unfolding in Japan's secret Unit 731. Led by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, this research facility became the site of some of the most inhumane acts in history. The worst of these horrors was vivisection without anesthesia. Imagine being fully aware as your organs are removed, your limbs are amputated, or your body is dissected. This was the grim reality for thousands of people trapped within the walls of Unit 731. Most of these victims were Chinese civilians, but Russians, Koreans, and Mongolians also suffered the same fate. They were cut open while fully conscious, enduring unspeakable pain. Their organs were removed or manipulated while they were alive, all in the name of studying the effects of diseases. The doctors believed that dead bodies wouldn't give them the results they were after, so these horrific dissections were conducted while the victims were fully conscious. The cruelty didn't end there. Some prisoners had their limbs amputated and bizarrely reattached to other parts of their bodies, while others had their circulation stopped to induce gangrene, slowly rotting their flesh while they remained alive. A former assistant at Unit 731 recalled the terror of hearing a victim scream as they were cut open from chest to stomach without pain relief. This was a regular occurrence, yet it left a deep mark on those involved. The total number of victims is unknown, but estimates suggest between 3,000 and 10,000 people lost their lives in Unit 731's cruel experiments. Though attempts were made to erase all evidence of these atrocities, surviving documents and testimonies have since exposed the true extent of the horror. Number 14. Cannibalism. It's hard to fathom the full extent of desperation that leads soldiers to commit the unthinkable. Yet during the darkest days of World War II, Japanese soldiers found themselves in such dire situations that they resorted to cannibalism. In some instances, this was an act of survival, but in many cases, it was much more chilling. Soldiers, struggling with hunger and disease, often turned to prisoners of war as a food source, sometimes even killing them for the sole purpose of consuming their flesh. This brutal practice wasn't isolated to a few incidents. Cannibalism was widespread across the Pacific Theater. Soldiers stationed in remote areas, cut off from supplies, found themselves faced with starvation. However, historians have discovered that hunger wasn't always the only motivation. In several cases, Japanese officers ordered the ritualistic consumption of human flesh, adding an even more nightmarish layer to the already horrifying practice. These acts were carried out not just as survival tactics, but also as a display of power and dominance, with commanders sometimes consuming the flesh of enemies as a form of ritualistic punishment. One of the most notorious examples of this occurred during the Chichijima incident in 1944. 8 American pilots were captured after their planes were shot down. While some were executed, others were used for a far more gruesome purpose. Japanese officers beheaded 4 of the airmen and ate parts of their bodies. They later claimed that consuming human liver had medicinal benefits, a belief that reflected how distorted their actions had become under the weight of war. There were also accounts from the Philippines, where members of the Suzuki unit resorted to cannibalism during their campaign. Soldiers described how human meat was brought into camps, boiled with vegetables, and eaten regularly. Filipino prisoners were targeted, captured, and butchered for their flesh. Testimonies revealed that even as hunger played a role, there was an undeniable element of savagery in how this practice was carried out. It wasn't just about survival. It became an accepted part of camp life. Number 13. Burning prisoners alive. It's hard to grasp the depth of cruelty that occurred during World War II. But one of the most horrifying methods of execution used by Japanese forces was burning prisoners alive. This brutal practice was carried out under orders, and it served a dual purpose, not only to kill prisoners, but also to erase evidence of war crimes. One of the most well-known examples of this atrocity occurred during the Palawan massacre in the Philippines. In December 1944, as Allied forces drew closer to the island, Japanese soldiers feared that American prisoners of war might be liberated. In response, they forced over 150 American prisoners into air raid shelters under the pretense of safety. Once inside, the entrances were doused with gasoline, and the shelters were set ablaze. The prisoners, trapped in an inferno, desperately tried to escape. Some managed to get out, but they were immediately shot or bayoneted by the waiting guards. Out of 150, only 11 men survived by digging their way out and escaping into the jungle. This method of execution was not unique to Palawan. The Japanese employed similar tactics earlier, elsewhere in the Pacific Theater. On Wake Island in 1943, Japanese forces executed 98 American prisoners, with many being burned to death after attempts to escape failed. Burning prisoners alive became a tool of terror in other parts of the war as well. In several documented cases, Japanese forces used fire as a way to destroy not only human life, but evidence of their atrocities. This gruesome act ensured no survivors and left behind little trace of the crimes. Number 12. Burial alive. Burial alive as a form of execution stands among the most terrifying methods used during World War II, particularly by Japanese forces. The cruelty of this punishment is hard to grasp. Imagine the absolute fear and despair that consumed prisoners as they were forced into the earth, knowing they would soon be buried, struggling for breath, and left to suffocate slowly in total darkness. Japanese soldiers used this method to execute prisoners, forcing them into pits and covering them with earth, ensuring a slow and agonizing death. These acts weren't isolated incidents. Throughout the war, many captured soldiers and civilians suffered at the hands of Japanese forces who viewed surrender as dishonorable. In fact, this method of execution symbolized the merciless approach taken by some members of the Imperial Japanese Army. Such executions were often carried out during the infamous Rape of Nanking, where upwards of 300,000 Chinese civilians were massacred. Many were buried alive, an act so brutal that even some of Japan's allies were shocked by the atrocities. As the victims were buried alive, the psychological torment was as severe as the physical suffering. Not only were they robbed of air, but they were also entombed in silence, alone with their own thoughts, as the crushing weight of the earth suffocated them slowly. This horrifying method inflicted maximum pain with minimal resistance, as many prisoners were already too weak from forced labor, starvation, or illness to fight back. It's reported that many of these executions occurred in prisoners of war camps, where conditions were already dire. Starvation, brutal labor, and deadly diseases plagued these camps, making any resistance to such gruesome punishments nearly impossible. The fear of being buried alive became a tool of psychological warfare, instilling terror in those who remained, knowing that at any moment they could meet the same horrifying fate. Number 11. Beheading of prisoners. Captured soldiers often held on to the hope of survival, but for many prisoners of the Japanese military, that hope was brutally crushed. Beheading, one of the most chilling forms of execution during World War II, was a tactic frequently used by Japanese soldiers. This method wasn't only a form of execution, it was a tool for intimidation and psychological warfare. Often, beheadings were performed in public or in front of other prisoners, forcing them to witness the horrifying deaths of their comrades. Japanese soldiers, deeply rooted in the samurai tradition of using swords, often used these weapons to carry out executions. Prisoners of war, including civilians, were subjected to these brutal acts, especially in occupied territories like China. During the rape of Nanking in 1937, Japanese forces carried out mass beheadings, killing thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians. One particularly gruesome event involved two Japanese officers who engaged in a competition to see who could behead 100 people the fastest. Known as the 100-man killing contest, these officers used their swords to slaughter Chinese prisoners in a brutal contest reported by the Japanese media at the time. Though the accuracy of the numbers involved has been debated, the fact remains that beheadings were a common method used to terrorize and dominate. In another infamous case, Australian commando Leonard Siflete was captured and beheaded by Japanese forces in 1943. A photograph of the moment before his execution became one of the most iconic images of the war, highlighting the cruelty inflicted on Allied prisoners. The practice of beheading was not only meant to kill, it was a deliberate attempt to instill fear in the remaining prisoners. Number 10. Use of prisoners for bayonet practice. Bayonet practice wasn't just a training drill for Japanese soldiers during World War II. It was an exercise carried out on live prisoners. This cruel practice was used to train soldiers in the art of close combat while turning prisoners of war into nothing more than targets. It was one of the most horrific ways Japanese forces dehumanized prisoners, especially in China, where countless civilians and soldiers were subjected to this brutal form of torture. Japanese soldiers would often line up prisoners who were bound and unable to defend themselves and repeatedly stab them with their bayonets. The soldiers aimed to improve their skills with these attacks, plunging the sharp blades into the bodies of their victims to simulate battlefield conditions. These exercises weren't conducted in secrecy. They were often performed in front of other prisoners as a form of psychological warfare, heightening the terror among the remaining captives. The practice of using prisoners for bayonet training wasn't limited to a few isolated incidents. It was widespread across many regions where Japanese forces were stationed, including China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. In one particularly well-documented case during the Nanking Massacre, Chinese prisoners were forced to endure this gruesome fate. Reports from survivors and historical accounts reveal how soldiers methodically practiced their stabbing techniques on live human beings. For the Japanese military, these exercises were seen as necessary for preparing soldiers for the intense, close-quarter fighting they would face on the battlefield. However, it also reflected the deep contempt Japanese forces held for their prisoners. They viewed surrender as dishonorable, and those who surrendered were often treated with extreme cruelty. For the prisoners, the bayonet practice was a slow, painful death, as they were repeatedly stabbed and left to bleed out or die from their injuries. Number 9. Forced medical experimentation. During World War II, one of the most horrifying acts carried out by Japanese forces was the forced medical experimentation on prisoners. Conducted by Unit 731, these experiments were performed on Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and even captured Russian soldiers. The victims were subjected to unimaginable cruelty, all in the name of developing biological and chemical weapons. Prisoners endured terrifying tests that included being infected with deadly pathogens like plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhus. The goal was to study the progression of these diseases, but these patients were never given a chance to survive. Once the infection took hold, the prisoners were often vivisected, cut open while still alive and without anesthesia, to allow the doctors to examine the effects of the diseases on their organs. This practice led to immense suffering and slow, agonizing deaths. Unit 731 didn't stop at disease research. Prisoners were also subjected to extreme conditions to see how much the human body could endure. Some were exposed to freezing temperatures until their limbs developed frostbite, only to have those limbs amputated and studied. Others were strapped into centrifuges and spun at high speeds until they died. To test the limits of blood loss, prisoners had their limbs amputated, sometimes without anesthesia, to monitor how long they could survive. One of the most horrific aspects of Unit 731's work was the complete disregard for human life. The victims weren't seen as people. They were referred to as maruta, or logs, indicating how little the researchers cared for their humanity. The suffering inflicted was not just a means to an end. It was a key part of the experimentation process, with researchers keen to observe how much pain the human body could endure. These experiments claimed the lives of over 3,000 prisoners directly within Unit 731, and untold thousands more suffered from the biological weapons developed there. Number 8. Torture interrogations. Torture in war isn't new, but what the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, did during World War II went far beyond anything imaginable. Their interrogations weren't about finding the truth. They were about breaking people, extracting confessions through extreme brutality. In occupied territories across Asia, anyone suspected of opposing Japanese rule could find themselves in the Kempeitai's clutches, and once in their hands, survival was not guaranteed. The Kempeitai's methods were as varied as they were horrifying. Electric shocks were a common tool of torture, often applied to sensitive parts of the body to maximize pain. Prisoners would be tied down, helpless, as shocks coursed through them. Beatings were just as common. Victims were struck with fists, wooden clubs, or metal rods, breaking bones and leaving them barely able to stand. The goal was to push the body to its breaking point, making resistance futile. One of the most feared techniques was the water torture, which will be discussed extensively in a later segment. There are accounts of the Kempeitai breaking fingers, smashing nails, and even dislocating limbs, using pulleys to stretch prisoners' arms and legs to unnatural angles. The goal wasn't just to extract information, it was to destroy both body and spirit. In some cases, prisoners were hung by their wrists or ankles, left dangling for hours, their joints slowly tearing apart. For the Kempeitai, death wasn't an accident, it was often the goal. Many prisoners didn't make it through the torture, and those who did were left with lasting physical and mental scars. Number 7. The comfort women system. The horrors of war extended beyond the battlefield for thousands of women across Asia. In 1932, the Japanese military established what would become known as the comfort women system, a network of sexual slavery that lasted until the end of the war in 1945. This system forced women and girls from countries like Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and others into military brothels, where they were subjected to continuous sexual violence by Japanese soldiers. The scale of this atrocity was massive, with estimates suggesting that between 50,000 to 400,000 women were exploited in these comfort stations across occupied territories. Many of these women were lured with false promises of legitimate work, such as factory jobs or domestic service. Once captured, they were forced into military-controlled brothels. In other cases, women were outright abducted from their homes or villages and coerced into sexual servitude. These women faced unimaginable abuse, often enduring repeated rapes, physical beatings, and psychological torture. Their daily reality was filled with suffering as they were forced to service dozens of soldiers each day. The Japanese government was heavily involved in organizing and managing this system. Military officials, with the help of local police forces in occupied regions, coordinated the transport and enslavement of these women. Military doctors regularly checked them for sexually transmitted diseases, yet provided no real care for the victims. Conditions in the brothels were horrendous, with many women contracting diseases, experiencing starvation, or being beaten to death. The trauma didn't end with the war. Many survivors were either executed by retreating Japanese forces to erase evidence, or they took their own lives due to the unbearable suffering. Those who did survive rarely returned home due to the stigma and shame they would face in their communities. Only about 10 to 25% of these women are believed to have survived the war, and many of them lived in silence for decades, too ashamed or afraid to speak out. Number 6. forced labor to death. During World War II, the Japanese military forced thousands of prisoners of war and civilians into grueling labor projects. One of the most brutal examples of this was the construction of the Burma Railway, often referred to as the Death Railway. This railway was built between 1942 and 1943 to connect Thailand and Burma, supporting Japan's military expansion during World War II. What should have been a feat of engineering became a nightmare for the 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and 250,000 Southeast Asian civilians forced to build it. Prisoners and civilians alike were forced to work under horrific conditions. The labor was grueling, with workers toiling for up to 18 hours a day, cutting through thick jungle, digging trenches, and constructing bridges. Their only tools were simple hand instruments, and they had little to no food or medical care. The rations consisted mostly of a meager 250 grams of rice, barely enough to sustain them. Disease was rampant, with cholera, dysentery, and tropical ulcers spreading quickly among the workers. Those who fell ill were often left to die, as there was no real medical treatment available. The Japanese guards were notoriously cruel. Workers who couldn't keep up with the brutal pace were beaten, tortured, or even killed. The most difficult section, known as Hellfire Pass, required prisoners to carve through solid rock with nothing but hand tools, and many died trying. The death rate was staggering. It's estimated that over 12,000 Allied prisoners and more than 90,000 civilians lost their lives during the construction of the railway. In some camps, up to 20 men died each day. By the time the railway was completed in October 1943, the damage was done. Many of the survivors carried the trauma of the forced labor for the rest of their lives, with some suffering from long-term health issues due to the brutal conditions they endured. Before we move on, here's today's subscriber's pick. What you see here is more than just a collection of shocking images. It's a haunting glimpse into some of the most brutal acts inflicted by the Japanese military during a dark chapter in history. The photo reveals scenes of unimaginable cruelty, prisoners bayoneted, their bodies pierced by the cold steel of a blade, others subjected to dissection without anesthetics, their agony stretching with every brutal incision. In one corner, we see a head hung ominously on a tree, severed from its body in a barbaric execution. Another figure lies twisted on the ground, their body reduced to skin and bone, a victim of extreme starvation. These scenes defy the limits of human cruelty, leaving us to reflect on the horrors that some endured during World War II. It forces us to ask, how could such acts be possible? What would drive humans to inflict such suffering on others? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Number 5. Forced marches. In one of the darkest days of World War II, the Japanese military forced tens of thousands of prisoners of war into grueling marches across occupied territories, and one of the most infamous was the Bataan Death March. After the surrender of American and Filipino forces in April 1942, roughly 75,000 soldiers were forced to march over 60 miles under brutal conditions. The prisoners, already weakened by months of starvation and disease, were given little food or water. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or illness were often beaten, bayoneted, or shot by their guards. The march took place in the sweltering heat of the Philippines, and the prisoners were forced to walk for 5 to 10 days with almost no rest. Water was scarce, and many men were denied any form of relief even when they passed wells or streams. Some who dared to drink without permission were shot on the spot. As if dehydration and starvation weren't enough, prisoners endured random acts of violence from their captors, including beheadings and beatings. The infamous buzzard squads followed the marchers, killing those who were too weak to continue. Filipino civilians who attempted to help the prisoners by throwing food or water were also executed on sight. The Japanese guards, driven by their disdain for surrender, treated the prisoners with extreme cruelty, believing that anyone who surrendered was dishonorable. This harsh treatment resulted in between 7,000 and 10,000 deaths during the march. Survivors of the march were packed into overcrowded rail cars for the final stretch of the journey to prison camps, where thousands more would die from disease and malnutrition. Number 4. Water torture. Water torture was one of the most brutal methods used by Japanese forces during World War II, especially by the Kempeitai. This technique involved forcing large amounts of water into the mouths and noses of prisoners. The victim, often restrained on the ground or a ladder, was helpless as water was poured until their stomachs were painfully bloated. This was not the end. Guards would then either jump on or press down hard on the prisoner's stomach, forcing the water back out in a violent, agonizing expulsion. This procedure was often repeated multiple times, with prisoners enduring excruciating pain, and in many cases, it led to death. The water torture was a favored interrogation method, as it left few external marks on the victim, but caused immense physical and mental suffering. Japanese guards used it not only to extract information, but also as a punishment, ensuring that prisoners suffered as much as possible. The sheer terror of the experience made many prisoners confess to crimes or give up valuable intelligence to their captors. In some variations, a cloth was placed over the prisoner's nose and mouth, and water was poured over it, making it impossible to breathe, causing the sensation of drowning. This version was a forerunner to modern waterboarding, but the Japanese version was far more violent, often coupled with beatings or other forms of torture. The impact of water torture on its victims was profound. Many did not survive, and those who did were left with long-lasting physical and psychological trauma. Number 3. Bayonet charges. Bayonet charges during World War II were terrifying displays of brutality. The Japanese military, particularly known for their aggressive tactics, used bayonet charges both on the battlefield and in prisoner executions. Soldiers were trained to charge at their enemies with bayonets affixed to their rifles, a weapon designed to pierce through the abdomen. But this wasn't only a combat tactic. In prisoners of war camps, prisoners were forced to kneel as Japanese soldiers rushed at them with bayonets, stabbing them repeatedly. This method of execution was slow, painful, and designed to instill fear among both the prisoners and any witnesses. The bayonet itself, like the Type 30 used by Japanese soldiers, was about 16 inches long, designed for close combat. It was not just a tool for killing, but also a psychological weapon, as its use up close was intended to demoralize opponents. Prisoners subjected to bayonet charges often faced slow, agonizing deaths, either from the initial stab wounds or from being left to bleed out afterward. This form of execution was not limited to isolated incidents, but was part of the broader cruelty exhibited in Japanese prisoner of war camps, where beatings, forced labor, and summary executions were common. Number 2. Rape and sexual violence. Throughout World War II, Japanese soldiers inflicted widespread sexual violence upon women and girls in occupied territories. This brutal tactic was not only an act of cruelty, but also used to control and terrorize local populations. In places like China, Korea, the Philippines, and other Southeast Asian countries, women were frequently rounded up by Japanese forces and subjected to mass rape. Often, these assaults were followed by the killing of the victims to prevent them from testifying. The horrific scale of sexual violence during the war became evident in events like the Nanking Massacre, where tens of thousands of women were raped by Japanese soldiers over a 6-week period. Such violence was not an isolated occurrence, but part of a larger pattern across occupied territories. Women were seen as spoils of war, and sexual assault was a common method used to assert dominance and instill fear. Many survivors of these atrocities faced lifelong trauma, both physically and psychologically. The violence they endured often left them stigmatized within their communities, compounding their suffering. Number 1. Starvation and dehydration. Starvation and dehydration were two of the cruelest weapons used in Japanese POW camps during World War II. Prisoners, both soldiers and civilians, were deliberately deprived of food and water, forced to survive on minimal rations. The guards withheld basic necessities as a way to break the spirits of those under their control. With only a limited diet of watery rice and whatever scraps they could find, many prisoners quickly became thin and sick. There was rarely enough to eat, and those who became too weak to work were often left to starve to death. Water, too, was severely limited. Guards frequently denied prisoners access to clean water, forcing them to drink from dirty sources, which led to the spread of diseases like dysentery and cholera. The effects of this deprivation were devastating. Thousands of prisoners died from starvation or dehydration, their bodies reduced to skin and bone. Those who didn't die immediately faced agonizing deaths from malnutrition-related illnesses, such as beriberi and scurvy. In some camps, up to 27% of the prisoners did not survive their captivity due to these harsh conditions. This deliberate starvation wasn't just an act of neglect. It was a methodical form of torture meant to weaken the prisoners and keep them from resisting or escaping. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.